What happens when cutting-edge firepower collides with unstoppable conquest? For centuries, Genghis Khan's horde seemed impossible to stop, sweeping across continents with unmatched ferocity. But what if in their path they faced something they could never have imagined? An Apache attack helicopter loaded for battle. On today's episode of the Infographics Show, we're unleashing one of the deadliest machines of the modern age against history's most brutal empire to see who comes out on top. Chief Warrant Officer Mike Buzar Rodriguez was having what he considered a perfectly normal Tuesday morning over the mountains of Afghanistan. Known to his peers by his call sign, Viper 7, he had been flying Apache helicopters for 8 years. And this milk run patrol was supposed to be routine reconnaissance, the emphasis on supposed to be. In the front seat, Staff Sergeant Danny Optics Gen handled the weapon systems with his usual quiet efficiency. Their AH-64D Apache longbow hummed with mechanical precision at 8,000 FT. All systems green, fuel tanks topped off, and enough ordnance to level a small city. Buzar had been ordered to investigate reports of unusual seismic activity near the Wakhan corridor, where intelligence suggested possible underground weapons caches. What the briefing didn't mention was that the so-called seismic activity was centered on a vast geological anomaly, a circular formation of rare earth minerals generating strange magnetic disturbances for weeks. Rodriguez's radio crackled with static as Chen called out the electromagnetic readings from his front seat displays. Chen did a double take at his instruments as they passed directly over the anomaly site. Every gauge went haywire simultaneously. Their radar altimeter started reading negative elevation. The GPS showed coordinates somewhere in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. Suddenly, the Apache's threat detection system was screaming warnings about electromagnetic pulses that shouldn't exist. The anomaly meter's needle slammed into the red so hard it probably broke. At the same time, their Apache smashed through what felt like an invisible wall of electricity. Every hair on their bodies instantly stood on end, and their helmet's radio filled with harmonics. Around the rotor blades, the air itself shimmered with a ghostly glow. The whole thing lasted maybe 3 seconds. When it stopped, Rodriguez was still holding at 8,000 FT, flying straight and level, still strapped into the same Apache helicopter. But everything else had changed. The mountains were gone. The radio chatter was gone too, as were the contrails of distant aircraft gone. Even the familiar brown and tan landscape of Afghanistan had vanished, replaced by endless rolling grassland that stretched into the horizon. The air was cleaner too. Rodriguez spat a mayday into his mic, his voice tight with panic. All he was met with was silence. Not even the comfort of static, just dead air across every channel. Rodriguez switched to emergency frequencies, then to international distress channels, then to random commercial aviation bands. The radio worked well enough he could hear his own transmissions through his headset. But deep in his gut, he felt like he was shouting into a void, with no one out there to hear him. His mind raced, trying to find a solution. And then he saw it. A dust cloud over the horizon. He realized that maybe, just maybe, they had stumbled into the kind of situation that wasn't covered in any of the detailed flight manuals they had read in training. Rodriguez's Apache bristled with enough technology to make NASA jealous. It could track 100+ targets simultaneously while hiding behind hills, sharing targeting data with allied systems via data link, and engage 16 separate enemies at once. The Apache was a $35 million testament to human engineering. The twin-turbo shaft engines produced 1,890 horsepower each, driving it to a top speed of 182 mph. Its arsenal was brutal. A 30mm M230 chain gun loaded with 1,200 armor-piercing rounds. It could also carry either 76 Hydra rockets and 4 pod launchers or 16 AGM-114 Hellfire missiles that could turn a tank into scrap metal from 4 miles away. It had enough firepower to take on a small army. And then there were the electronics, thermal imaging systems, millimeter wave radar, GPS navigation accurate to within 3 FT, and robust night vision systems. Right now, all of it was telling him he had somehow ended up in the geographical equivalent of Atlantis. The dust cloud on the horizon was getting bigger, a lot bigger. And as Chen switched to thermal imaging to get a better look, his blood went cold. The heat signatures weren't anything like he'd ever witnessed in Afghanistan or anywhere else. They weren't vehicles either. On his screen, thousands of horses thundered across the land in perfect formation. Their riders carried bows and swords stretching for miles like a living wave of death and destruction. Both men stared in stunned silence, struggling to make any sense of it. The year, though neither could possibly know it, was 1279 AD. The Mongol Empire was at its absolute peak. Genghis Khan had unified the warring tribes of the steppes, and he was in the middle of conquering everything from China to Eastern Europe. His vast army of roughly 150,000 nomadic warriors was the most effective military force the world had ever seen. They were armed with composite bows that could punch arrows through armor, curved sabers that could decapitate a man in a single stroke, and possessed a tactical acumen that enabled them to crush every threat they'd ever faced, until now at least. The dust cloud resolved into individual shapes as Rodriguez flew closer. What he saw made him request his sanity. Thousands of horses, tens of thousands, all moving in perfect unison across the grassland. He had never seen anything like it. At the head of the formation, banners fluttered in the wind. They were not flags he recognized, but something that looked distinctly medieval and Asian. Rodriguez hovered at the crest of the hill out 2 mi away, while he tried to process what he was seeing. Through Chen's thermal imaging system, the heat signatures were unmistakable. Roughly 10,000 warriors on horseback arranged in the traditional Tumen formation he recalled from his military history classes. At the formation's heart, a dense cluster of larger signatures marked the command staff. Bigger horses, heavier armor, and at their head was one figure whose heat profile burned brighter than them all, clad in more metal than any other. He had to be the commander. That commander squinted into the mist, wondering about the faint buzz he was hearing. His name was Subutai, arguably the greatest military tactician in human history. Subutai had conquered more territory than Alexander the Great, Hannibal and Napoleon combined. He had never lost a battle in 40 years. He was personally responsible for the deaths of more people than the Black Plague. And right now, as the tiny Apache came into view, he was staring up at something that his 13th century mind had absolutely no framework to comprehend. Subathi squinted upward, shading his eyes against the sun. The thing wasn't flapping its wings, but it was making a sound like thunder that never ended. It was too far away to hit with arrows, too high for their horses to reach, and it was just hanging there watching them. In 4 decades of warfare, he had seen and heard rumors of every possible battlefield innovation. The much-vaunted Greek fire, siege engines, crossbows, even primitive Chinese fire lances. But this was something otherworldly. Subutai raised his fist into the air. The signal rippled through the ranks like a wave, and 10,000 horses came to a perfectly coordinated stop. Whatever this thing was, it warranted investigation before they proceeded. The Apache crew watched the entire army stop moving through their optics and felt a chill run down their spine. That level of discipline and coordination wasn't something you saw in irregular forces or local militias. This was a professional military unit operating at the highest possible level of efficiency, which meant they were probably looking at the actual Mongol army, which meant that they were in serious trouble as their fuel gauge inched lower and lower. Rodriguez decided to make a low pass for effect. Maybe they were friendly. He nosed the Apache forward and flew low over the horses. The effect on the Mongol army was immediate and dramatic. Horses reared, warriors pointed skyward in alarm. And what had been a perfect military formation dissolved into chaos as 10,000 mounted soldiers tried to figure out how this mythical beast had materialized. Subutai, to his credit, maintained his composure even as his horse danced nervously beneath him. He'd heard stories from the Chinese prisoners about dragons that could breathe fire, and shamanic legends about sky spirits that communicated with thunder and lightning. But those were stories. This was happening right in front of him. But no matter the panic coursing through the ranks, the Mongol unit held firm. On Rodriguez's screen, the heat signatures shifted as the warriors reformed into what looked alarmingly like a combat formation. He tightened his grip on the controls. It was time for a demonstration. The Apache's power was about to be unleashed. Chen selected his first Hellfire missile. It cost almost $150,000 in 2025. Laser-guided, carrying a 20 LB high-explosive warhead, it could reach 995 miles per hour and strike targets up to 5 miles away with a margin of error of less than 3 ft. Sure, it was overkill for a medieval cavalry, but he figured whether this was some strange simulation or a new time-warped reality, he was going to make a point, and he might as well make it emphatically. He designated the target roughly 1,600 meters in front of the Mongol formation, close enough to demonstrate his capabilities, far enough away to avoid unnecessary casualties. The missile seeker head locked, and Rodriguez squeezed the trigger. The Hellfire dropped away from its rail mount and ignited, accelerating to Mach 1.3 in the span of a few seconds. From the Mongol perspective, a streak of fire had suddenly appeared in the sky, trailing smoke and making a sound like 1,000 arrows fired at once. The flight time took just 8 seconds. The explosion lit up the steppe, visible for miles. The missile struck the grassland with a force of artillery, hurling dirt and debris skyward in a violent plume. The sound was unlike anything the Mongols had ever heard. Louder than the worst thunderstorm, sharper than the crack of lightning, it reverberated long enough to echo off distant hills. Every horse in the Mongol formation went berserk simultaneously. Warriors who'd faced every imaginable threat without flinching were suddenly dealing with something completely foreign and mythical. Horses that had been trained for warfare since birth were trying to flee in all directions at once, and the disciplined formation was disintegrating into chaos. Subutai himself was struggling to keep his warhorse under control while trying to assess the tactical situation. The strange demon had just demonstrated the ability to throw explosives with pinpoint accuracy from a distance greater than the range of their best archers. It could hover motionlessly in a position where their weapons couldn't reach it. And if it could do that once, it could presumably do it again. Rodriguez watched the chaos through his optics, and he felt a momentary pang of sympathy. These were brave men and skilled warriors, but they were dealing with technology that wouldn't be invented for another 8 centuries. It was like bringing a Gatling gun to a sword fight, except worse. Instead of dispersing, something unexpected happened. Subutai regained control of his horse, raised his banner, and began shouting orders in Mongolian. The chaos gradually organized itself back into formation. Granted, it wasn't the tight parade ground formation they had before, but a looser, more flexible arrangement that could quickly respond to threats from above. Rodriguez and Chen watched in professional admiration as 10,000 panicked cavalry reformed into combat units in under 2 minutes. These weren't amateurs. Then he noticed that some of them were dismounting and pulling what looked like bows from their saddles. Rodriguez shook his head in disbelief. Through his thermal optics, he watched hundreds of Mongol archers raise their bows and loose volley after volley into the sky. The arrows reached their maximum altitude and fell harmlessly back to the earth. But the fact that they had tried it at all told Rodriguez something important about the people he was dealing with. They were brave enough to fight back against impossible odds and disciplined enough to maintain unit cohesion under supernatural attack. In other words, they were exactly the kind of enemy you didn't want to underestimate. He decided to give them 30 seconds to disperse. Knowing their arrows were probably harmless, he nosed in for another low pass. The Mongols ducked instinctively, but they did not break ranks. The 30 seconds were up. Chen selected his 30mm chain gun. Time for a more comprehensive demonstration. The M230 chain gun was a masterpiece of battlefield design. It spat out around 625 rounds per minute, each one leaving the barrel at over 2,600 FT per second with an effective range pushing 9,800 FT, and every single round cost more than $100. Chen targeted a section of the empty ground between his position and the Mongol formation. He squeezed the trigger for exactly 2 seconds and unleashed $2,000 worth of depleted uranium. 20 high-explosive dual-purpose rounds chewed up the grassland in a perfectly straight line, each impact throwing dirt and debris 20 feet into the air. From the Mongol perspective, the Sky Demon had just spit fire and torn up the earth in a display of raw destructive power. This time, even Subathi's legendary composure cracked. His horse reared so violently that it nearly threw him. And when he looked at the line of craters that had been carved into the earth, he understood that he was facing something beyond military tactics or personal courage. He gave the order to retreat. In 40 years of warfare, Subutai had never run from anything. The Mongol withdrawal was as disciplined as everything else they did, but there was no mistaking the supernatural terror that drove it. Warriors who had conquered half the world fled across the steppes, and the dust cloud that had seemed so threatening 20 minutes earlier was soon disappearing over the horizon. Rodriguez and Chen watched them go through his helmet-mounted thermal optics and felt a complex mixture of satisfaction and unease. On one hand, they had just single-handedly routed thousands of the most effective warriors in human history without inflicting real harm or suffering a scratch. On the other hand, they just used $152,000 worth of ammunition to accomplish what should have been a routine crowd dispersal operation. Over the next 5 days, Chief Warrant Officer Rodriguez and Staff Sergeant Danny Chen established what military theorists would call temporary air supremacy over the West Asian steppes. Operating from a makeshift forward base near a freshwater spring, they controlled roughly 200 square miles of medieval Mongolia by virtue of being the only humans on Earth who knew how to fly. The psychological impact was immediate. Local tribes fled their territories or left offerings of food and livestock, hoping to appease the Thunderbird. Both Americans found themselves accidentally worshipped as sky gods while rationing their remaining fuel like liquid gold. But deep down, both were scared. The Apache was burning fuel fast and engaging the Mongols felt less like combat and more like slaughter. An uneven fight neither side truly understood. The tactical advantages were overwhelming but temporary. Thermal imaging detected humans from miles away day or night. Their weapon systems were supernatural by medieval standards. A single hellfire, for example, could eliminate entire cavalry units, and the chain gun could breach fortifications in seconds. But every flight hour brought them closer to becoming the world's most expensive lawn ornament. The real problem was mathematics. At current consumption rates, they had maybe 15 hours of flight time left. Their remaining ammunition of 6 Hellfires, 1,100 rounds of 30mm, and 20 Hydra rockets could win battles but not wars. And maintenance issues were mounting. Dust ingestion, temperature extremes, and mechanical stress from constant operations. Meanwhile, the great Genghis Khan was analyzing reports with the calculating mind that had conquered half the world. Unlike his superstitious subordinates, the great Khan treated the Sky Demon as a tactical problem. It struck from a long range. It relied on overwhelming firepower for psychological effect, and it avoided close combat, which meant it had vulnerabilities. By day 8, Rodriguez's fuel gauge read 45 gallons, maybe 90 minutes of flight time in perfect conditions. His engine oil pressure was fluctuating, and hydraulic fluid was leaking somewhere he couldn't identify. The Apache was dying a slow death. The forced landing came during what should have been a routine intimidation flight. The engine temperature spiked and hydraulic pressure dropped as Rodriguez found himself executing an emergency auto-rotation in a narrow valley 30 meters from their base camp. The landing was textbook. The Apache was intact, the pilot unhurt, but the aircraft was completely unflammable. Genghis Khan's intelligence network located the crash site within 2 days. The great Khan himself rode out with a select force to capture the Sky Demon. It was too valuable an opportunity to waste on mere revenge. The Apache crew's last stand was brief but professional. Their M4 carbines held 30 rounds with another emergency mag, which was enough to drop several Mongol scouts before the inevitable happened. When the ammunition ran out, surrender became a survival calculation rather than a tactical choice. Genghis Khan's war council was a masterclass in reverse engineering. The great Khan assembled the empire's brightest minds from across the empire, including Chinese engineers, Persian scholars, and captured artisans from a dozen conquered cities. Incredibly, they wanted to understand the Sky Demon's weapons and adapt them to Mongol warfare. The Mongols couldn't comprehend engines or electronics, but they understood mechanical principles. Rotor blades became very fancy sword material, and optic systems were incorporated into existing equipment as seeing crystals. Rodriguez watched grimly as the Apache was dismantled piece by piece. Fortunately, the Mongols had decided he and Qin were worth more alive than dead. The helicopter soon became the centerpiece of Genghis Khan's psychological warfare strategy. Paraded across the steppes as proof of divine mandate, a unified superstitious tribes under Mongol authority. Rodriguez himself was displayed as the captured Sky Demon servant, living proof that even supernatural forces bowed to the great Khan's will. Chen, by contrast, seemed amused by his fate. Honored as a guest, yet kept close as Subutai's reluctant advisor, the Khan implemented revolutionary military doctrines based on his other-worldly Apache encounter. Anti-aircraft tactics centuries before aircraft existed, improved metallurgy from analyzing components, and distributed command structures to prevent decapitation strikes. Rodriguez suspected he might have just jump-started the Renaissance by 2 centuries as he watched Mongol smiths struggle to copy modern weaponry with medieval tools. He and Chen could only reflect on their strange fate, now sporting Mongol mustaches and serving as history's most reluctant military consultants. In the end, war was never about the best toys. It was always about the smartest player, and if one helicopter could change the fate of empires, imagine the chaos of an entire warship. Check out what if a single modern aircraft carrier traveled to 1941 Pearl Harbor, or click on this video.